The director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, not to be confused with the Scowcroft Center, which is at the Atlantic Council, which Dr. Aslund is at. So we have two Scowcroft institutions, one in Washington and one in Texas. And we're friends, and we work together occasionally, but we're separate institutions. So our speaker this evening is Dr. Anders Aslund, one of the foremost experts in the West on Russia. In his most recent book, Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market Economy to Kleptocracy, he's going to speak about this evening, as I think a remarkable piece of scholarship with a lot of evidence. So there's been several books written on this subject, but this Dr. Aslund has found new sources of information that have not been available before to other scholars. So I think he's woven this into a very interesting narrative. Dr. Aslund is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He's a specialist in economic policy in Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. He has served as an economic advisor to several governments, notably the governments of Russia and Ukraine, probably not right now. He published widely and is the author of 15 books and has edited 16 books. He's a professor at the Stockholm School of Economics and the founding director of the Stockholm Institute of Transitional Economics. He has worked at the Peterson Institute, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Brookings, the Kennan Institute, and the Woodrow Wilson Center. He served as a Swedish diplomat in Kuwait, Poland, Geneva, and Moscow. His PhD is from Oxford University. He's a member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences. We are honored to have him speak this evening. Anders, the floor is yours. And we'll entertain questions after Dr. Aslund is finished.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Matthews, for your invitation, and to the Bush School and to the Scowcroft Institute. It's a pleasure to be here, even if only virtually. And my intention is to try to speak for slightly more than half an hour, and then I'm happy to take whatever questions you would like to have. So if we start with the picture, this is the cover of the book, and you see Putin in blood red for a reason. Next picture. And my thesis is quite simple. Russia is an authoritarian kleptocracy. Putin combines secret police, the KGB, and organized crime, criminal St. Petersburg, which was like Chicago under prohibition in the early 1990s. To think of it, Putin was then deputy head of the mayor's office, in charge of foreign investment. He was in charge of the port. He was in charge of the most criminal parts of the city administration when St. Petersburg was at its most criminal. And my emphasis is these are the two important things, and we should emphasize them and not so much the rest. Next slide. And on the positive side, Putin believes in macroeconomic stability. You wonder why? Well, because he saw in 1998, when Russia had a financial meltdown, that those who were in power then lost power. He does not want to lose power. And he also sees from Western sanctions that you need to have a lot of macroeconomic stability in order to maintain sovereignty. So what does this mean? Putin wants very big international currency reserves, more than $570 billion. He wants to maintain a very low public debt. It's now 18% of GDP, that is virtually nothing. Think of most of the West having about 100% of GDP. And inflation is reasonably low. It's going up now, but the latest count is 5.7%. Unemployment is reasonably low, 5.8%. Next slide. What is not good is economic growth. You can't eat macroeconomic stability. You need food, means economic growth, in order to thrive. And Putin's legacy is quite clear. I've drawn here two red lines, and you see during his first 9 years in power, 2000 to 2008, Russia had an average economic growth of 7% a year. Since 2009, Russia has had 1% a year in economic growth. And if you take from 2014, it has essentially been zero. So what does this tell us about Putin? I like this simple picture because that tells you what is really happening. Putin has chosen kleptocracy over national strength and welfare. He's not interested in Russia becoming great again. That's not his agenda. His agenda is put all power to Putin and all money to Putin and his friends. And if you are so focused on it, you can't really do much more. Next picture. What I argue in this book, which is different from others, is that Putin has focused on building 4 circles of power. And the first is control the state. This is what Putin did during his first term. The most important thing is the old KGB, now called the FSB, and he has insisted on having control over that. He was chairman of FSB for the year before he became prime minister in August 99. The other is state finances. Putin understands that you need macroeconomic control. And the third is the judiciary. And this he did during his first term, when he was everything to everybody. You can say that this was the best period for Russia's economic growth and also for property rights. In his second term, Putin surprised us because he turned against state capitalism. Still during his first term, there was some privatization, but during his second term, 2004 to 2008, he instead starting building up big state companies. And during his third, we would say informal term, because Dmitry Medvedev, his underling, was formerly president, but Putin was the real ruler, even if he was only prime minister. And then we saw something completely different. His cronies, that I will describe later, stripped assets from state companies and transferred money abroad. And this I come to the fourth circle, which I emphasize and that too few have paid attention to until recently. And that is the Anglo-American offshore, which is the weakest link of the Putin system. And I'll return to that later on also. Next picture. This is how Russia is ruled. This is the first circle of state power as I described it. And you can see there is one woman who's not present in this picture. Otherwise, there are 12 members of the Russian Security Council, which has really replaced the Politburo. It meets about every 10th day. It is always chaired by Putin. Otherwise, it doesn't meet. And Putin is now holding these meetings online, just as we are meeting today, because Putin is a complete hypochondriac, and he sits in his dacha outside of Moscow or in Sochi on the Black Sea. We do not actually know where he is much of the time, but it's he alone. If anybody wants to see Putin, they need to go through quarantine for 14 days, even if they happen to be a president, or for example, Armenia, they have to go through this quarantine and a lot of medical checks. Putin has been vaccinated himself, he claims, but nobody has seen it, while he's normally exposing himself in all kinds of ways on photos. He refused to show when he was vaccinated, which was at the end of March. And he also refused to say what vaccine he was taking, which it has led to Russians not believing much about vaccines. But the big importance with this picture is that if anybody would oust Putin, it would be these not so gentlemen. They're all KGB generals. This is Sergei Ivanov, his former chief of staff that Putin could not sack. Sergei Narishkin, chief of foreign intelligence. Alexander Bortnikov, head of FSB, and Nikolai Patrushev, former head of FSB, after Sergei Ivanov, but before Bortnikov. And Nikolai Patrushev is now the secretary of the National Security Council. These are the four people who could oust Putin. And needless to say, they are all KGB generals. There are two more generals here, the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Defense. And you can also see who is not here. I'm not thinking of women. I'm thinking of heads of state companies who are otherwise very important, and oligarchs. The oligarchs are out. The oligarchs are not relevant in the power structure today in Russia. So let me then turn to what is really happening in the economy. Next slide. Putin wants obedience and state capture. And I like these two numbers that I'm giving you. Russia has risen from a place 120 in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business to 31. The World Bank has unfortunately changed this scheme now, so it's not comparable. But what this means is Putin wants the state to be efficient. He wants his decisions to be carried out, which is good in itself. The Russian tax system today functions extremely well. It's highly computerized, etc. But then we have the other point. Russia is now number 129 out of 176 countries on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. So what this says is that Putin wants a kleptocracy that works for him. He's not in favor of any rule of law, and he's not in favor of any kind of equitable distribution. He's perfectly happy to have 100 billionaires, as is the situation in Russia steadily now. So let us look upon these characters, who they actually are, and their yachts and their palaces. Next picture. These are the two top state enterprise managers. To the left, you see Igor Sechin, the chief executive of Rosneft, which produces 20% more oil than Exxon. And to the right, we have Alexei Miller, the head of Gazprom, the biggest gas producing company in the world. What do they have in common? They carried the briefcase for Putin when he was a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. So Putin wants people who have been with him, who have been absolutely loyal, and if they know anything about anything, who cares? They are just supposed to be loyal. And if we look up on their value as businessmen, Miller is probably the most expensive chief executive in the world. He has destroyed $300 billion of enterprise value. And Sechin, $150 to $200 billion, depending on how you count it. These are very, very bad managers. They are destroying the value of the companies, and they are taking away the wealth from Russia. So what happens with this wealth? Let's move to the next picture. Here you see Igor Sechin, the man who, the Russian journalist, Roman Anin, who published this piece. He was just arrested a couple of days ago for this very thing. Such a yacht costs about $150 million. And he, Sechin named it for his then wife, second wife, Princess Olga, who then eloped, I'm afraid to say, with an Italian racer driver. You can't have it all. So instead, Sechin is now building a minor palace outside of Moscow for $350 million to console himself, while he has the journalist who did this thrown into prison. Sechin made his original career as an interpreter from Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique in the 1980s, probably in the military intelligence. Next picture. And as you could see, Alexei Miller is not quite as attractive as Igor Sechin, who has to make do with one of his $350 million palaces outside of Moscow, just in case he claims that it's not his. Next picture. So first we have the group of state enterprise managers. There are several others of them, but I just took the two most important. Then we have four people who are Putin's real cronies. These are four men who made their money entirely on their connection of with Putin. They are no real businessmen. They are just cronies. They had nothing before Putin came in. And this is the most wealthy of them, Gennady Timchenko. And I should say that these cronies, exactly as the KGB generals I showed before, they are all born in one year, 1952, and they all come from St. Petersburg. So Putin is a very, very tight group. This is a real mafia organization. And Gennady Timchenko is Novatek, which is a gas producing company, quite efficient, but it has got its gas licenses from Gazprom. So this is asset stripping. Sibur, which is the biggest petrochemical company in Russia, and that is also asset stripping from Gazprom. And then oil trading has skipped, but that was his basic business. Gas pipeline construction, and here he did it thanks to getting the construction companies from Gazprom cheaply. So this is a man who lives on cheap assets from Gazprom that Putin has delegated to him because Putin really controls Gazprom. And Forbes puts his value at $23 billion. I think it's much more. Whenever you see these numbers, I think that one should multiply them by 3. So next picture. And here you see Timchenko's yacht. This is a $300 million yacht. The biggest oligarchs now have $600 million yachts. It's Alexei Rusmanov and Roman Abramovich. But you can see that Timchenko has a bigger yacht than Sechin. And in Moscow, Your value is and position is counted by how large a yacht you have. Next picture. And here we have a second of Putin's cronies, Arkady Rotenberg, who is probably Putin's closest friend. They did judo at least since they were 12 years old together, and he's the king of state orders. So Russia's state orders are concentrated to this man. And what does he do? He does essentially two things. He builds gas pipelines in the same way as Timchenko. Rotenberg has got his construction company from Gazprom, and he's also doing road construction. So he is the main builder of the Sochi Olympics. And also when Putin needed somebody to build a bridge across the Strait of Kerch between Russia proper and Crimea, where did he turn? Well, first he tried with Timchenko, and Timchenko was mean enough so that he refused to do it because he did not want to be so severely sanctioned. Then Arkady Rotenberg stepped in and built it for a minor sum of $5 billion. You know, you have to sacrifice yourself for your true friends. Next picture. And here we have Boris Rotenberg, who's the junior partner of Arkady. They are doing everything together. Timchenko, that I showed before, and Boris Rotenberg are actually Finnish citizens. The US sanctioned all these gentlemen, or not so gentlemen, in March 2014 because of their role in as Kremlin oligarchs. But Europe did not sanction Boris Rotenberg and Gennady Timchenko because you don't sanction your own citizens. Next picture. Here you can see this is one of the Rotenberg's brother's palace, and the other brother has a palace just across. These are relatively small palaces of only 50 to 100 million dollars each. But the Rotenberg brothers want to be close to one another. And this is a very close circle. Next picture. This is the least known, most important person in Russia. Yuri Kovalchuk, as all the others, a contemporary of Putin from St. Petersburg. And normally you hear people talk about Russian state television. In fact, 20 of the 22 main television channels in Russia are controlled by 3 holding companies that are formally owned by Yuri Kovalchuk. That is, they are owned by offshore companies and through other people, but they are controlled by Kovalchuk. And he also controls Bank Rossiya in St. Petersburg, which you can see as the holding company in the financial circle of Putin. So all the top Putin cronies had a share of them, but Kovalchuk owns one third of it. I'm happy to tell you that the US sanctioned Bank Rossiya in 2014, together with these 4 Putin cronies. And then we come to the most important palace. Next picture. This is Putin's 1.3 billion palace close to Sochi, which he has built for himself. And when Alexei Navalny made a film of it and showed exactly how it was being done in excruciating detail with all the documents that he had managed to get and lots of pictures inside. This film, which I strongly recommend, it cost, it has been seen by 115 million people. It's an almost a 1 hour long film, and it's a very good film. You can see it on YouTube with English subtitles. So what does Putin do when this is all being revealed and given massive propagation? Well, of course, it's denied, but his press secretary denies that Putin owns it. And then after 2 weeks, Arkady Rotenberg, his closest crony, steps up and said, in fact, I bought the palace. And in this way, trying to ease it from Putin's burden. Of course, nobody believes in it. But the point is that they don't really care. Next picture. So how large is the crony outflow? The pioneering work here was by my late friend, Boris Nemtsov, who was shot outside of the Kremlin in 2015, and Vladimir Millerhof, who's now a deputy for economic affairs of Alexei Navalny. And it's about $15 billion a year from 2004 to 2007 from one single company, Gazprom, the state gas giant, and then add to that state orders and bank loans, and you get a total of $15 to $25 billion a year since 2006. And this gives us a total crony outflow from Russia from 2006, when currency was liberalized, of $200 to $320 billion. And the total Russian private holdings abroad are probably about $1 trillion. This is private money. It's not the central bank reserves or state enterprise money. So next picture. The big question is how much belongs to Putin? I put it at about, say that his cronies hold about $250 billion. And this is just seeing the outflow of the money from Russia. And Putin there in the range of $100 to $160 billion. Much of his evidence comes from the Panama Papers from April 2016 that Putin was convinced was a CIA Hillary Clinton trick in order to expose him. And the cronies that I've described to you before, they hold officially, according to Russian Forbes, $29 billion. I think it's much more than that. And then what is funny, if you still look up on Russian Forbes, there are 4 childhood friends from St. Petersburg who hold between $500 million and $2 billion each. And then Putin has 4 cousins who have now been given about $500 million each. So Putin is spreading it out, clearly being afraid that he will lose it all, and he is spreading it to him. And Putin's lifestyle is that he has 25 official residences in Russia himself. And these are by and large state-owned residences, apart from this palace that I showed. So this is a massive amount of money. So you wonder, why do they keep all this money? And I think that there are several explanations. One is you have to be very wealthy in order to be considered serious in Russia today. And another is that you have a certain hierarchy. So if you can't support your hierarchy, then you will lose your base. But next question is, where is the money going? Next slide. And there are essentially 3 requirements. What do you want if you're a serious kleptocrat? first of all, you want good rule of law, which means essentially Western countries. The second is anonymous companies, which means Anglo-American law, because in European continental law, there are secret companies, but there are very few. And the third thing you need is deep financial markets, because you have a lot of money, you have billions. And where can you go then? Essentially, you can only go to two countries, the United States and the United Kingdom. Traditionally, money left from Russia through Cyprus. This has been interrupted because of a financial crisis in Cyprus in 2013. And now it goes through all kinds of channels. Then it goes to the British Virgin Islands, and their companies are being formed. And then it goes to Cayman Islands, which has 1.8 trillion invested in US securities. This does not include real estate. So Cayman Island is the second most important investor in US securities, with 60,000 people, but 158 banks. And then comes, it's after Japan, but before the United Kingdom and China. And of course, the United Kingdom is also a lot of Russian money. So how much of this is Russian? We don't know. The US Treasury does not know, but probably a few $100 billion. And then the money goes to Wilmington, Delaware, and to the United Kingdom. And much of it is invested in real estate, which is safe, but gives a low return. So next slide. What does this say about Putin? It says a lot. We cannot expect any domestic political or economic reform, because that would break his authoritarian kleptocracy. And increased domestic repression is possible, as we are not seeing, but not inevitable. After all, Russia has only about 250 political prisoners, which is relatively or very little for such a severe dictatorship. So the dominant policy is small victorious wars. The words of the Russian Imperial Minister of Interior, Vyacheslav von Plehve, in 1904. That was before the Russo-Japanese War, but he was murdered then. And this is what Putin did in August 2008 in Georgia, and with annexing Crimea in 2014. On both occasions, his approval rating skyrocketed to 88%, the highest. Normally it's about 65%. And this is the question: is Putin trying to do something similar with Ukraine? Well, that's a much tougher nut to break. And next picture. And this is my final conclusion on this. The West should stand up to Russia. This is the central thing. And how can it stand up? Maintain and reinforce sanctions, and I emphasize particular financial and personal sanctions. Think of it that Russia has been stagnant since 2004. And while the Central European countries that are more developed, like Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, and Hungary, they have been growing at 4 to 5%, while Russia has not been growing. So my argument is that probably financial sanctions take away 2.5 to 3% of GDP in growth each year. So Russia is falling behind ever more. And the second policy is transparency. Reveal all ultimate beneficiary owners. And as it is, both the European Union has adopted such legislation 3 years ago, and the US just did it last New Year. which means that within 3 years, all ultimate beneficiary owners of LLCs, the main forms of companies, will have to register with US Treasury, the financial police. So I think that this is the most important thing. And then the West can win with asymmetric warfare, exposing the wealth, because the wealth will have to be kept here. And why? Well, because there are no property rights in the former Soviet Union, and therefore the wealth has to be held abroad. You can only maintain the wealth if you hold political power. That is also power over the courts. And if these people lose power, they will have to leave. So these are my brief messages. I should just summarize as saying, in the discussion here in the US, you see that there are essentially two groups. One is the realists who think that we need to come to agreements with Russia, and the other is more the people who want to engage and stand up and fight, whatever you call them. Liberal engagement is a common form, and you can see where I say stand. And behind this is that realists, they think that Putin cares about national interest. I don't think so. I think that he cares about two things: wealth and the political power. And then we should have very few illusions about cooperation. There are areas where one can cooperate, typically arms control. Nobody wants to be blown up by mistake, by nuclear arms. Climate change, that's a universal interest, and perhaps in certain other regional conflicts, terrorism and Iran are being mentioned. I'm very skeptical about terrorism because Putin considers his opposition as a terrorist. So thank you. I'll stop there and leave for questions and comments.
Let me just ask you a few questions before we get to the audience questions. The first is that you're actually proposing a new theory of international relations, that gangsters have taken control of Russia. I mean, you used Chicago in the 1920s as a comparison, which is very interesting because that's exactly the term President Obama used to describe Putin, as basically like the gangsters of Chicago, where he comes from 100 years ago. And that's different than a dictatorship. It's a step further, but it's fascinating because there is a book about Saddam Hussein when he was still in power, arguing that there were concentric circles of control that he maintained to keep in power. The first of which was his family and his tribe, and then the Sunnis, and then so he had these similar, but they weren't exactly the same, of course, as Russia. Well, the question I have is, what are they going to do with all this money abroad? What's the purpose of it? If they are ejected from power, they may, it may be very unpleasant. They may not get out alive, because there are people really angry with Russia, with Putin within Russia. And it could be that his own people turn on him. I think I read your reports a lot, the ones that are not published in book form or articles. But you said that the last reformer in Putin's cabinet was arrested by Putin and charged with some kind of infraction or something, because he was a technocrat who was actually competent at managing things, and he was a threat to Putin, so Putin got rid of him. You also said that unlike predecessors, the KGB generals are moved every 6 months or something, because he's afraid there could be a coup against him among the generals if he becomes unpopular. I noted that the polling data showed, after the photographs were made public of his palace, that his poll ratings among younger people went from 35% approval to 20% almost within a week. And so even though that was not the whole country, it did damage him. So my question to you is this. You say that he will engage in small wars, but could those small wars lead to larger wars with countries in the periphery, with NATO, who misinterpret what he does? Is there a risk of a conflagration that would be larger than a small war?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that a lot of countries in the world are really ruled by gangsters. If we look upon Africa, if you take Democratic Republic of Congo, Mobutu or Kaliba, these are gangsters in power, and a lot of the African countries, and Bokassa, Equatorial Guinea, and of course Syria and Iraq. So I think that about half of countries in the world are run really by authoritarian kleptocrats. Of course, people tend to see what they are used to see, even when it doesn't quite exist. So this is my bias. I think that this is very standard. In the former Soviet Union today, you can say that there are 12 countries, and 7 of them are authoritarian kleptocrats and kleptocracies, and 5 of them are oligarchic states with no steady rule of law. So you have to be an oligarch in order to defend your properties. And the Saddam Hussein parallel, I think, is perfectly correct that you drew. And also, the Assad family in Syria would be perfect. Well, for example, Iran is more complicated. Then on the KGB generals, I showed there, he sits together with 4 KGB generals who are from St. Petersburg, and they are exactly 68 years old, all of them. And they have known each other forever, and Putin cannot oust them. So this is the curious thing, that there is some limitation to Putin. So Putin ousted Sergei Ivanov, whom I actually know because he was a KGB agent in Sweden. So he speaks good Swedish. In an official reception, he comes up to me because he wants to keep his Swedish alive. And it was then quite pleasant. And Putin sacked him as his chief of staff in August 2016, but it's still in the Security Council. So Putin could not move him all the way. And there we see that there is some limitation. So it's these KGB generals who could check him. So you come to the question, will there be too much war? And of course, if you look upon the last century of Russian history, we have 1905, the Russian-Japanese War, which led to a substantial popular uprising or revolution. We have World War I that led to a revolution, and we have the Afghan War that led to the ouster of the regime in August 91. So war is typically something that goes wrong, and of course it can be terribly wrong, as we saw with World War I. And also, I'm thinking of the Graham Allison's book about the threat of China, that World War I was started by the main declining power. Austria-Hungary that declared, the Habsburg Empire that declared war on Serbia. So it was not started by any of the Germany, Britain, France, or Russia, but the weakest of the powers, Austria. And why? Well, because they felt that they were on the way out. And Russia, you can say, is a typical declining powers situation, but it will never be as strong militarily again as it is now. And what do you do in such a situation? You start a war. If I take from the Swedish history, the attack in the mid 17th century by Poland by Sweden on Poland was because after the 30-year war, Sweden had a wonderful war machine. Why not use it? Why not do a useless war? So from was it 1655 to 1660 in Poland, one of the worst wars that Sweden ever undertook. And I think that this is a direct risk. And of course, your follow-up question is immediately, what can we do about it? Stand up. So therefore, one should not try to be soft. One should try to be firm, while not provoking.
So let me ask you this latest incident where President Biden was asked, is Putin a killer? And he said, yes. And of course, the Russian ambassador was withdrawn and they threatened a lot of fairly aggressive measures. It's interesting how sensitive they are when they actually call us names all the time. The question is, will I've heard people say, diplomats who know Russia well, this is worse relations between the United States and Russia than they were during the Cold War right now. And this is interesting. It's not under the Republican administration, it's under Joe Biden because of the history of the 2016 election and the perception of Russian involvement in the election. So how could things get worse? Could there be an incident in the Ukraine? Right now, they're mobilizing, apparently.
Yeah, it's an obvious danger. But going back to the worst previous time, it was 1983, when I was a diplomat in Geneva then, and there were massive peace demonstrations all over Europe against Western posting of Pershing IIs in Europe. And that, of course, solved the whole thing. So what happened then was that Ronald Reagan did three things. He stood up to the Soviets, not refusing to talk to them for the first 5 years of his presidency. No nonsense. We don't talk to people who are not serious. And I think that Biden should do the same. Second, put out the nuclear missiles. And then call the Soviet Union the evil empire. So I put this Biden statement killer in the evil Reagan evil empire category. What happened? Russia got a new leader with Gorbachev, and in 1987, the Soviet Union and the United States concluded the most important arms control treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which Trump abandoned. So I think that what we are seeing so far from the Biden administration, it is standing up first orally, and then make sure that there is a sufficient military strength. And now I think that sanctions are far more important than they ever was before.
Okay. Is Russia trying to follow any of Communist China's economic policies? This is one of the questions that one of the members of the audience posed.
Amazingly not. They really, Putin has not discussed any serious economic reform since he came back to power formally in 2012. So, and last July, he put out what seemed to be a plan for the Russian economy until 2030. and he only wanted the standard of living to keep up with inflation, which is, means he does not want economic growth. For his population, there's no discussion of reforms. So Russia is now very much a rent-seeking economy. It lives on these big state companies, and it's the big oligarchs who are taking over. Putin doesn't care about economic growth. He doesn't care about standard of living. He cares very much about macroeconomic stability.
Is there any reason that Russia should be worried about China? I mean, they have Siberia is relatively thinly populated and has vast resources, and China needs the resources. And they have a lot of people, and they need land. If I were Putin, I'd be very nervous about an alliance with Russia. I suppose you embrace with China. I suppose you embrace your opponents when you're afraid of them, and that's what he seems to have done. But there is a risk with a border that long with China.
I hear from a Russian analyst of China. They describe the situation like this, that Putin and Xi Jinping, they get along royally. Then they delegate their decisions to the ministers who get along so-so. And then it goes down to the chief executive of the state enterprise companies, and they don't want to deal with one another, so nothing comes out of it. So this is an example when Putin and Xi Jinping can't get it done. And more specifically, Russia is adamantly against allowing any Chinese investment in raw materials in the Far East. So the Russian suspicion of China is very deep, and the Chinese contempt of the Russian is great. As it is now, Russia and China has almost exactly the same GDP per capita in dollar terms. So, so last year, for the first time, China surpassed Russia in GDP per capita. And 20 years ago, Russia had a GDP per capita that was 4 times higher than China's. So China has very quickly caught up with Russia. And this should be a major consideration.
Okay. You mentioned 2 laws, one regulation by the EU, and the other you and I discussed in our conversation before we had this Zoom call, or this Zoom event. And I was fascinated by, because I remember signing a letter that I was asked to sign on this transparency legislation, and I did. And I compared the letter, I found the letter that I signed with what you told me about. It's the same piece of legislation, except it wasn't passed separately. It was put in to one of the supplemental budgets. And the question I have for you is, this is a radical change in transparency for American corporations, and they agreed to it. I think either you told me or I read somewhere that they were sick of paying large fines for basically subsidizing criminal enterprise, the big bank, Western banks, and that in order to protect themselves and their investment, their shareholders, they decided they needed transparency, and they wanted it to be for everyone through this new law. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because it's very important, I think.
Yeah, this is extremely important. And I think that this is arguably one of the most important national security laws that has been adopted. So it was adopted as part of defense, the must pass defense bill. But it was adopted by both parties in both chambers with big majority. And the essence of it is the Corporate Transparency Act is that within 1 year, FinCEN, the financial police of the US Treasury, will have to set up a register for all companies, and they will have to register within 2 further years. So this is for all LLC. So it's not all companies, trusts and foundations are not covered by it, but most companies are LLCs. And this is a massive number of companies. So it's a question of millions of companies that now have to register. And as you said, it was the banks that were pushing for this, because the banks, after having paid hundreds of billions of dollars in fines, they have spent billions of dollars each year on compliance in order to know that they are not getting into money laundering, for which they could have a large fines. So therefore, the banks demand that the state gets the information so that they can reduce the cost for compliance. And the person who has been leading this is Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. He started this in 2014. And the people who are most against it is the American Bar Association, or parts of the American Bar Association, because the lawyers make a lot of money on dubious ownership, while for the banks, dubious ownership is primarily a cost. While if you look upon Europe, the banks in Europe have not been pushing because the fines in Europe are so much lower than in the US. So it's rather the big US fines. Altogether, the US banks from 2008 to 2014 paid $350 billion of fines for all kinds of violations. Money laundering is an important part of it. Corruption is another part. All these funny mortgage businesses is a third. So, and there are other things also. But the banks are afraid of the US authorities. And it goes on, some is Department of Treasury, some is the Department of Justice, some is other state institutions. So there are a lot of state institutions that are pushing up there and saying, you don't behave, now we want to charge you fines. And primarily the banks are paying, banks have lots of money. So therefore, they want to defend themselves. In Europe, these registries will be public, or are public already, while here in the US, they will be held by FinCEN, and they will be available to law enforcement and to banks, financial institutions. But I guess that this will go further. So this is a massive change. And also now I saw in the Biden's budget that he calls for 50% increase in these enforcement of the Treasury activities.
Okay. Is there any modeling that goes into understanding the regions and the Russian economic system, or is this all, what is your sources for a lot of this, other than the Panama Papers?
Well, if you take the big sources, Panama Papers is a massive source, and more comes out when people study it. There are, I talked to one of the investigative journalists in Russia, and I asked her, how can you know all these things? And she says that there are three fundamental sources. The first is divorced wives. They have a real document, and they really want to screw their former husband who didn't pay them enough. The second, which you would not easily think of, it is commercial lawyers who have been sacked. They also have the documents, and they really want to take revenge. So these are two important sources. And then you have business partners who have been sacked in one way or the other. So therefore, we are seeing this coming out quite often. And it's quite amazing in Russia that we see in particular Novaya Gazeta that works with this OCCRP organization, that they have done lots of fine work. And then it is, for example, Reuters and Bloomberg who are doing such work, and the other Russian newspapers. So when it comes to wealth, I referred here to Russian Forbes, and Boris Nemtsov and Vladimir Millerhof in their original analysis of Gazprom and later of the Sochi Olympics. The Russians actually do a lot of very serious work, and Bellingcat basically does not do this, but they do more investigative work. And then it's, for example, that in Moscow, you can easily get on a commercial basis all number plates of cars. And in this way, they have established cars that are registered with the GRU headquarters and with the FSB headquarters. And this is then freely available on a commercial basis. So, Russia is a country with lots of centralized registries, which don't exist in the US or the UK. And therefore, they can use all of this material.
Very interesting. Karen DeWissa, in her book, which she wrote before her death, she used court records from criminal prosecutions by Western European law enforcement against Russian criminals. And she used the court proceedings, which are public record. I found that fascinating, that because court records, they tend to be more accurate than the newspaper investigations. And so I was expecting you to use that as one of the sources, but so it appears you've used other sources which are confirming a lot of what she wrote, except in much more detail than she had in her book. Can you tell us what you think Putin is actually worth?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that Putin is worth 100 to 150 billion dollars. That this is his ballpark. And then you wonder, what do you need all this money? But you will never use it. Well, he needs to have more money than anybody else. Otherwise, he's not the most powerful person. It's the same that I showed with his yachts and these palaces. You must have the biggest palace. You must have the biggest yachts. So the two most important oligarchs, they have $600 million yachts. Otherwise, you're not a serious person.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're now out of time. Anders, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I would urge everyone to buy the book. I found it's very well written. It's well rehearsed. I mean, well researched, and very informative. And it should help us to understand Russian foreign policy better. I recognize there are different schools of international relations theory, which I personally do not subscribe to, on the left and the right. And I think the regime's intentions do have something to do with how they behave in terms of their foreign policy. But anyway, thank you very much for being with us, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Pleasure to talk to you.
Yep. Bye.